John Kerr, Governor-General. Sir John Robert Kerr, 24 September 1914, 24 March 1991, was an Australian barrister and judge who served as the 18th Governor-General of Australia, in office from 1974 to 1977. He is primarily known for his involvement in the 1975 constitutional crisis, which culminated in his decision to dismiss the incumbent Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and appoint Malcolm Fraser as his replacement, unprecedented actions in Australian federal politics. Kerr was born in Sydney to working-class parents. He won scholarships to Fort Street Boys High School and the University of Sydney, where he studied law. His legal career was interrupted by the Second World War, during which he served with the Australian Army's Directorate of Research and Civil Affairs (DORCA), and attained the rank of colonel. After the war's end, he became the inaugural head of the Australian School of Pacific Administration. Kerr returned to the bar in 1949 and became one of Sydney's leading industrial lawyers. He joined the Australian Labor Party (ALP) and was briefly an endorsed candidate for the 1951 federal election. He let his membership lapse after the party split of 1955. Kerr served terms as president of the New South Wales Bar Association and the Law Council of Australia. He was appointed to the Commonwealth Industrial Court in 1966, later serving on territory Supreme Courts, and as Chief Justice of New South Wales 1972-1974. On the nomination of ALP Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, Kerr was appointed Governor-General in July 1974. The Whitlam government did not hold a majority in the Senate, and following a series of controversies in 1975, most notably the loans affair, the Liberal opposition leader Malcolm Fraser decided to block supply in an attempt to force an early election. Kerr regarded the situation as untenable, believing the Prime Minister was obliged to either resign or call a general election, which Whitlam was unwilling to do. On 11 November 1975, Kerr used his reserve powers as Governor-General to dismiss Whitlam and his ministry, appointing Fraser to lead a caretaker government. He immediately granted Fraser's request for a double dissolution, leading to a federal election which saw Whitlam and the ALP defeated in a landslide. The dismissal of the government sparked demonstrations from Whitlam's supporters, with the anger directed at Kerr a major factor in his early retirement. The propriety, legality, and wisdom of his actions surrounding the dismissal have been subject to considerable debate and analysis. Early life. Kerr was born in Balmain, Sydney, New South Wales, on 24 September 1914. He was the eldest of three children born to Laura May Nee Cardwell and Harry Kerr. His younger brother Dudley was born in 1917 and younger sister Elaine in 1926. Kerr's parents and maternal grandparents were Australian-born, while his paternal grandparents came from Sunderland, England, arriving in Sydney in 1886. He came from a line of waterside workers. His father was a boiler-maker, his grandfather was a stevedore, and his great-grandfather was a shipwright. At the time of his son's birth, Kerr's father was employed at the Eveleigh Railway workshops. He was sacked 3 months later, but soon found work at the Cockatoo Island dockyard, which were at full capacity due to the ongoing war. He was involved in the union movement and participated in a number of strikes, including the 1917 general strike, during which he went without pay for 2 months. Work at the docks became irregular after the war's end, and he eventually rejoined the railways in 1925. For the first 2 years of his life, Kerr and his parents lived with his paternal grandparents in a weatherboard cottage in Balmain. They later rented cottages in Rosal and Dulwich Hill, buying the latter outright only in 1949. Kerr began his education at the Birchgrove Public School. He won a scholarship to attend the prestigious Fort Street Boys High School, where he excelled academically. He topped the school in English, history, and chemistry in his final year. His contemporaries remembered him as quite aloof. One of his few close friends was Francis James. In deciding to pursue law as a career, Kerr found a role model in H.V. Evatt, a fellow Fortian who in 1930 became the youngest ever High Court judge. In the same year, Evatt completed a doctoral thesis on the royal prerogative. Kerr's father knew Evatt through his membership of the Labour Party, which Evatt would eventually lead, and had helped him on his successful campaign for the state seat of Bamane in 1925. Evatt became the first in a series of patrons who helped Kerr progress in his career despite a relatively humble background. Legal career. In 1932, Kerr began studying law at the University of Sydney. He again excelled academically, winning a number of prizes, but had little interest in extracurricular activities. One of his closest friends was Kenji, who eventually joined him on the judiciary, but was also known for his flirtation with Trotskyism. Kerr eventually graduated in 1936 with first-class honors and the University Medal. He was called to the New South Wales bar in 1938. The same year, Kerr married Alison Peggy Worsted, with whom he had 3 children. He spent World War II working for the Australian intelligence organisation and think tank, the Directorate of Research and Civil Affairs. In 1946, he became principal of the Australian School of Pacific Administration and the first Secretary-General of the South. Kerr returned to the bar in 1948, becoming a prominent lawyer representing trade union clients and a member of the Labour Party. P. 142 he intended to seek Labour endorsement for a parliamentary seat at the 1951 election, but withdrew in favour of another candidate. P. 135 after the Labour Party split of 1955, however, he became disillusioned with party politics. He disliked what he saw as the Labour Party's leftward trend under Evatt's leadership, but was not attracted to the breakaway group, the Democratic Labour Party. P. 146 later in the 1950s, he joined the anti-communist advocacy group established by the United States CIA, the Association for Cultural Freedom, joining its executive board in 1957. P. 248. In the 1960s, Kerr became one of Sydney's leading industrial lawyers. In the 1950s, he had become a QC. P. 144 in 1964 he was one of a group of lawyers which also included future NSW Premier Neville Wran, who lent their expertise to the defense of the publishers of the satirical magazine Oz. Judicial career. In 1966, Kerr was appointed a judge of the Commonwealth Industrial Court and, later, to several other judicial positions. P. 192. During this period his political views became more conservative. He became a friend of Sir Garfield Barwick, the Liberal Attorney General who became Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia in 1964. Kerr was the first chairman of the Law Association for Asia and the Western Pacific Law Asia, founded by Justice Paul Toose and John Bruce Pigott in 1966. Kerr served as chairman of that organization until 1970. P. 172. Kerr was appointed Chief Justice of New South Wales in 1972. Sir Paul Hasluck was due to retire as Governor-General in July 1974, and the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, needed to find a suitable replacement. His first choice, Ken Meyer, declined. He then offered the post to Mr. Justice Kerr, as he then was, who accepted on condition that he could expect to have 10 years in the office, and that he could represent Australia overseas as head of state. These discussions commenced in September 1973. Kerr was announced as Governor-General designate on 27 February 1974, by which time he had become Sir John Kerr. He had been knighted in the New Year's Honours of 1974, on the advice of the Premier of New South Wales, Sir Robert Askin, after Whitlam had declined to endorse his predecessor Billy McMahon's recommendation for that honour, which Hasluck had wisely held back pending the outcome of the December 1972 election. Kerr did not know Whitlam well, although they had shared legal chambers some years earlier. but he had remained friends with several ministers in Whitlam's government, such as Jim McClelland and Joe Riordan. Kerr's wife Peggy was a fellow student of Margaret Whitlam during university days. P13 Whitlam seems to have believed that, because of Kerr's former membership in the Labour Party, he was still politically reliable, without realizing that Kerr's political views had changed and that he had come to see the role of Governor-General differently from Whitlam. Governor-General. The Whitlam government had won a second term in May 1974 following a double dissolution, and picked up an additional 3 Senate seats, leaving it on equal numbers with the Liberal Country Party coalition and with the balance of power held by 2 independents. The new parliament was opened by Sir Paul Hasluck on 9 July, and Kerr was sworn in as Governor-General on 11 July. The disputed bills that had led to the double dissolution were reintroduced, and, as expected, were again rejected. The conditions for a joint sitting of the Parliament had now been met. On 30 July, Kerr signed a proclamation convening the historic joint sitting of the Australian Parliament on 6 and 7 August. All the contested bills were passed. On 9 September his wife Peggy died after a long illness, aged 59. In April 1975, he married Anne Robson, who had recently divorced her first husband, Hugh Robson QC, a New South Wales judge and former colleague of Kerr's. Through her, Kerr acquired 2 stepchildren. During 1975, the government was enveloped by a series of ministerial scandals, the Loans Affair, which resulted in the sacking of 2 senior ministers, Rex Connor and Deputy Prime Minister Jim Cairns. The Liberal opposition leader, Malcolm Fraser, decided to use the Senate to block the government's budget bills, thus forcing an early election for the House of Representatives. This is called blocking supply. On paper, the Australian Constitution gave the Governor-General wide-ranging powers, including the power to appoint and dismiss ministers and to dissolve Parliament. However, by 1975, the office was viewed as having become almost entirely ceremonial, and it was understood that in most cases the Governor-General was bound to act on the advice of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. Whitlam and others held the view that the Governor-General had no discretion in the exercise of these powers, that they must always be exercised on the advice of the Prime Minister and never otherwise. Kerr and others disagreed fundamentally with this view, arguing the Constitution very clearly set out the Governor-General's powers. In addition to the powers normally exercised only on the advice of the Prime Minister, there are certain uncodified reserve powers exercisable on the Governor-General's own initiative. Kerr chose to make a study of the reserve powers through his earlier professional relationship with Vatt, the author of the standard work on the reserve powers as they applied to the British Dominions, the King and his Dominion Governors 1936. P. 8388 Kerr was familiar with this book and reread it before accepting Whitlam's offer of the Governor-Generalship. 1975 crisis. The dismissal. Kerr had another meeting with Fraser with Whitlam's approval on 6 November. At this meeting, Fraser increased the pressure on Kerr, advising him that the opposition would not back down and would not accept any compromise, warning him that if he did not take action against Whitlam, then the opposition would begin to make direct public criticism of him for having failed in his duty. P. 237-238 Fraser urged Kerr to bring about an election before the end of 1975. The provisions of the Electoral Act meant that the last date on which a 1975 election could be announced was 11 November. On 9 November, Kerr consulted the Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia, Sir Garfield Barwick. P. 341-342 Kerr asked Barwick to advise him on whether he had the constitutional power to dismiss Whitlam, and Barwick advised him in writing that he did. P. 342-344 He also advised him that at least one other High Court justice. Kerr appears to have made up his mind on 9 November to dismiss Whitlam. He felt it necessary not to disclose this intention to Whitlam and his ministers because of his fear that Whitlam would advise the Queen to exercise her constitutional power to terminate Kerr's commission as Governor-General. p. 331. In so doing, Kerr was aware of the precedent set by Sir Philip Game, the governor of New South Wales, who had dismissed Jack Lang's government in 1932. Game had warned Lang in advance that if he, Lang, did not withdraw certain regulations, then he, Game, would dismiss him. This allowed Lang to seek Game's dismissal if he dared, which he did not. On the morning of Tuesday, 11 November, Whitlam phoned Kerr and arranged to see him at 12:45 p.m. after the Remembrance Day ceremonies. Kerr also arranged for Fraser to come a quarter of an hour later. Mr. Fraser was not told why I wanted him to come. p. 356. Fraser later claimed that Kerr telephoned him p. 292 and asked him whether, if he were commissioned as Prime Minister, he would pass the budget bills, call an immediate double dissolution election for both houses of Parliament, and make no appointments, initiate no new policies, and conduct no inquiries into the previous government before such an election. Fraser recalled answering yes to all these questions. In his memoirs, Kerr denied making such a phone call to Fraser, but Fraser was adamant in all subsequent accounts that he did. The House of Representatives was suspended at 12:55 p.m. for the luncheon break. Whitlam arrived at Government House at 1 p.m., 15 minutes late. Fraser had arrived earlier and been shown into another room. p. 356. Whitlam and Kerr met alone in Kerr's study. Kerr knew that Whitlam intended to ask for a half-Senate election, one which would need to be conducted without supply. p. 357. So, after reconfirming that Whitlam's intention was to govern without parliamentary supply, Kerr withdrew his commission and served on him the letter of dismissal. Kerr claimed Whitlam then sought to telephone Buckingham Palace to advise Kerr's dismissal, but Whitlam has always denied this. At a press conference that afternoon he said the Governor-General prevented me getting in touch with the Queen by just withdrawing the commission immediately. p. 359, in an article in Quadrant magazine, March 2005, volume 49, number 3, David Smith. When Whitlam had left, Kerr summoned Fraser, p. 364, and asked him the same questions which Fraser claims to have answered that morning. When Fraser answered affirmatively, Kerr then commissioned him as Prime Minister. Kerr later put forward 5 propositions to justify his actions. The Senate had the right under Section 53 of the Constitution to block supply. The government had an obligation to obtain supply through Parliament. If the government could not obtain supply, it had either to resign or call an election. If the government refused to do either of these things, the Governor-General had a right and a duty to act to intervene. Since the Prime Minister could at any time advise the Queen to terminate the Governor-General's commission, the Governor-General had a right to dismiss the government without advance warning of his intention to do so. Kerr later stated that Whitlam represented something that perhaps I might have been, had I stayed in the party as he did, and it has been suggested that the dismissal was as much a case of a thwarted ego seeking his place in history as Whitlam's mismanagement of the economy. After Kerr's death, his former embittered close friend, Whitlam cabinet member James McClelland, claimed that Kerr had long aspired to be top dog in Australia, that Kerr had once made a pass at him, and that the dismissal could only be fully understood if Kerr's alleged repressed homosexuality was factored in, that an infatuation with Whitlam had become one for Fraser. After the dismissal, the news that Whitlam had been dismissed spread across Australia during the afternoon, resulting in angry protest demonstrations by his supporters. Over the following month, leading to the double dissolution election scheduled for 13 December 1975, Whitlam and ALP supporters constantly and intensely denigrated Kerr, no doubt in the belief that the electorate would prove sympathetic to the deposed Labour government. In the ensuing election campaign, the Australian Labour Party's focus was predominantly on the asserted illegitimacy of the dismissal, with the slogan of "Shame Fraser, shame," while the coalition focused on criticism of Labour's economic management. Some expected a major backlash against Fraser in favor of Whitlam, who had launched his campaign by calling upon his supporters to maintain your rage, based on opinion polls in October and early November which had shown disapproval of Fraser's tactics. Once the election was called, however, the majority focused on the economy and responded to the Liberals' slogan, "Turn on the lights." Despite the passion of die-hard Labour supporters, furious at what they saw as an establishment plot to destroy a Labour government, Labour suffered its greatest ever loss, 7.4% down on its 1974 vote at the hands of the coalition, which continued to hold power until 1983. Labour supporters continued to voice criticism and demonstrate against Kerr. He found the personal attacks on him and his wife, whom Whitlam and others accused of having been a sinister influence, deeply wounding. For the rest of his term as Governor-General, Kerr was rarely able to appear in public without encountering angry demonstrations. On one occasion his life was thought to be endangered when he was unable to leave a speaking engagement in Melbourne except by having his car drive through an angry crowd. Labour parliamentarians, federal and state, refused to accept his legitimacy as Governor-General, shunning official functions where he was in attendance. Near the end of his term, he famously appeared drunk when he presented the 1977 Melbourne Cup. Resignation. Concern about his health may have been one reason why he cut short his 5-year term and stood down in December 1977. In fact, his resignation had already been proposed as early as March 1977 during the Queen's visit. Fraser denounced Kerr's detractors as a hostile and bitter minority whose actions were unjustified. P. 423 Kerr was appointed to the post of ambassador to UNESCO, an office which he felt unable to take up because of continuing bitter attacks on him both inside and outside the Parliament. P. 424 Bill Hayden, the new leader of the Labour Party, now in opposition, was one of the critics of the UNESCO appointment. In the Parliament he stated, "The appointment of John Kerr as ambassador is not just an indecent exercise of the rankest cynicism. It is in every respect an affront to this country." P. 428. Later life and death. According to historian Philip Knightley, the remaining years of Sir John Kerr's life were miserable ones. He was subject to relentless harassment whenever he appeared in public. Jack Waterford observed that, above all, Sir John's legacy was to make the Viceroyalty a most controversial post and himself one of the most discussed persons ever to occupy it. In 1991, Kerr was confirmed to have died from a brain tumor at the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney, where he was in a coma, survived by his 3 children and his second wife. The family withheld announcement of the death until after Sir John's burial at Macquarie Park Cemetery and Crematorium Macquarie Park. This ensured the then Labour government would not be put in the position of deciding whether to offer a state funeral, an honour that would normally be considered automatic for a former Governor-General. The second Lady Kerr died in 1997, survived by the 2 children of her first marriage. Kerr's children are Gabrielle Kibble, a town planner and later NSW State Director of Planning, Kristen Johnson, a psychiatrist, and Philip Kerr, a solicitor. Honours. John Kerr was appointed a Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George CMG on 1 January 1966 for services as President of the Law Council of Australia. This was done on the recommendation of the Australian government, then led by Sir Robert Menzies. In 1972, the Prime Minister, Billy McMahon, had recommended Kerr for a promotion within the order to Knight Commander KCMG, to be announced in the 1973 New Year's honours. In view of the impending federal election scheduled for 2 December 1972, and the knowledge that the Labour Party's long-standing policy was not to support imperial honours, Governor-General Sir Paul Hasluck chose not to forward such recommendations to the Queen, pending the result of the election. After Gough Whitlam's election, Hasluck asked him if he were willing to endorse McMahon's recommendation for Kerr's knighthood, but he declined. Kerr was appointed KCMG in the New Year's honours of 1974, for services as Chief Justice of NSW on the recommendation of the UK Foreign Secretary on behalf of the Premier of New South Wales, Sir Robert Askin. In 1974, he was made a Knight of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. On the establishment of the Order of Australia on 14 February 1975, as Governor-General he was made Principal Companion of the Order AC. When the category of Knight was added to the Order on 24 May 1976, he was made Principal Knight of the Order AK. In 1976, he was elevated to Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George GCMG. He had asked Gough Whitlam for this appointment shortly after becoming Governor-General in 1974, but was rebuffed. On 30 March 1977, he was appointed Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order GCVO, an award within the personal gift of the Sovereign for services as Governor-General. This award was made by the Queen during an official visit to Australia and was conferred on board HMY Britannia in Fremantle Harbour. He was appointed a Privy Councillor in 1977 on the instigation of Malcolm Fraser. This was another appointment he had unsuccessfully sought from Whitlam in 1974. In Whitlam's book The Truth of the Matter, he claimed that Fraser also asked the UK Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan, to grant Kerr a peerage, specifically a viscountcy, but that Callaghan refused. Books, letters, articles, Kerr, John Robert, 1979. Matters for Judgment. Sun. Whitlam, Edward Go, 1979. The Truth of the Matter. Penguin. Kelly, Paul, 1995. November 1975. Allen and Unwin. Kelly, Paul, 2000. Paradise Divided. Allen and Unwin. ISBN 1-86508-291-0. Kelly, Paul, 1976. The Unmaking of Go. Angus and Robertson. Freudenberg, Graham, 1977. A Certain Grandeur, Gough Whitlam in Politics. Macmillan. Horn, Donald, 1976. Death of the Lucky Country. Penguin. Hasluck, Paul, 1972. The Office of Governor-General. Markwell, Donald, 2016. Constitutional Conventions and the Headship of State, Australian Experience. Connor Court. ISBN 9781501,501,155. Dimbleby, Jonathan, 1994. The Prince of Wales, a Biography. New York, William Morrow and Company. ISBN 0-688-12996-X. Ayres, Philip, 1987. Malcolm Fraser, a Biography. William Hahnemann, Australia. ISBN 0-85561-6-6-3. Blackshield, Tony. George Williams, 2010. Australian Constitutional Law and Theory. Commentary and Materials 5 ed. Annandale, NSW Federation Press. pp. 470-480. ISBN 978-1-86287-773-3. House of Representatives, Hansard, 11 November 1975. The Kerr Palace Letters at the National Archives of Australia,